The morning sun rose over the dense jungles of Bataan in early 1942, casting long shadows across the dirt roads where the remnants of Filipino and American forces had dug in for what everyone knew would be a brutal fight. The air was thick with humidity and the distant rumble of artillery fire that never seemed to stop anymore. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka stood beside his Type 95 Hago light tank, running his hand along the riveted steel hull with something between pride and unease. At 24 years old, he was one of the youngest tank commanders in the Imperial Japanese Army's 7th Tank Regiment, and he had believed every word his superiors told him back in Tokyo, that Japanese armor was invincible, that their training was superior, that the Philippine campaign would be over in weeks. But standing here now 3 months into the invasion, Hiroshi was beginning to understand that war looked very different from the propaganda posters. His crew gathered around him. Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto, the gunner, who never smiled but never complained either. Private Takeshi Ito, barely 19, who operated the hull machine gun with shaking hands. And Corporal Yuki Sato, the driver, who could navigate terrain that would break other tanks but who had started looking older with each passing day. The jungle is wrong, Hiroshi thought, watching the tree line. Back home, they had trained in open fields, practiced maneuvers on flat ground where you could see your enemy from a kilometer away. Here, visibility ended at 50 meters. The trees grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground, and every shadow could hide an enemy position. Captain Nobuyuki Ishida, the company commander, approached with maps rolled under his arm and exhaustion carved into his face. He had led 60 tanks into the Philippines. Now he commanded 37. The others had been lost not in glorious tank battles, but to mechanical failures, impassable terrain, and ambushes they never saw coming. We are to advance through the village of San Miguel and secure the crossing at the Pantingan River, Ishida announced, spreading the map across Hiroshi's tank hull. Intelligence reports minimal enemy resistance. Hiroshi studied the map, noting the narrow roads, the steep ravines, the countless places where a tank could become trapped. Intelligence has been wrong before, sir. Ishida's jaw tightened. We have our orders, Lieutenant. Across the encampment, other tank crews prepared for the advance. Hiroshi recognized the faces. Lieutenant Masaru Fujimoto, who had lost his entire crew to a roadside mine last week and now commanded a replacement crew who barely knew each other. Sergeant Daichi Nakamura, whose tank had thrown a track twice in the past month. And Private Hideo Watanabe, the youngest driver in the regiment, who still wrote letters home to his mother every night as if they would ever be delivered. The Type 95 tanks lined up in formation, their diesel engines coughing to life in clouds of blue smoke. These machines had seemed so powerful back in Manchuria, so modern compared to the Chinese equipment they had faced. But the Philippine jungle was already proving to be a far more dangerous enemy than any human opponent. Hiroshi climbed through the turret hatch, settling into the cramped commander's position. The interior smelled of oil, hot metal, and the sweat of 4 men crammed into a space barely large enough for 3. He adjusted his headset, hearing the crackle of static as the radio network came alive with voices from other tank commanders. All units. This is Captain Ishida. We advance in 10 minutes. Maintain formation. Watch for obstacles. Remember your training. But what training prepared us for this, Hiroshi wondered, looking out through the vision slit at the jungle that seemed to press in from all sides. They had trained to fight Russian tanks on the frozen plains of Mongolia. They had studied German tactics from the European theater. No one had trained them for roads that collapsed under their weight, for mud that swallowed tanks whole, for an enemy that refused to fight in the open. Private Ito loaded a high-explosive shell into the breech of the 37mm main gun, his hands steadier now that they had a mission. Sergeant Yamamoto checked the gun's traverse, ensuring it could swing left and right in the cramped turret. Corporal Sato revved the engine, feeling the transmission's response, listening for any sign of the mechanical failures that had claimed so many other tanks. The radio crackled again. All units advance. The column lurched forward, 23 tanks moving in single file along a road barely wide enough for one. The jungle pressed close on both sides, branches scraping against armor, the canopy above blocking out the sky. They were blind, vulnerable, and everyone knew it. Hiroshi keyed his microphone. Driver, steady pace. Gunner, watch the flanks. Machine gunner, eyes on the tree line. But even as he gave the orders, He felt the weight of what they were about to face settling over him like the humid air itself, heavy and inescapable. The column had barely traveled 2 kilometers when the first tank hit the mine. The explosion tore through the morning silence like thunder. A massive eruption of dirt and metal that sent Lieutenant Fujimoto's tank lurching sideways off the road. The left track disintegrated in a shower of steel links, and the hull settled at an angle that told Hiroshi immediately it was finished. Halt. Captain Ishida's voice cracked through the radio. All units hold position. But holding position meant sitting exposed on a narrow road with jungle pressing in from both sides and nowhere to maneuver. Hiroshi scanned the tree line through his periscope, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every shadow suddenly looked like a gun barrel. Every rustling leaf could hide an enemy soldier. The crew is evacuating, someone reported over the radio. Fujimoto is injured but alive. Then the ambush began. The first anti-tank rifle round punched through Sergeant Nakamura's tank from the side. The armor-piercing bullet finding the thin side plating that the designers back in Japan had assumed would never face direct fire. The interior of the tank erupted in sparks and screaming. Black smoke poured from the hatches as the crew scrambled to escape, 2 of them on fire, rolling in the dirt to extinguish the flames. Contact left. Hiroshi shouted into his microphone. Gunner, traverse left. Find that position! But the jungle swallowed sound and muzzle flash alike. Yamamoto swung the turret desperately, searching for targets that remained invisible. Another round clanged off their turret armor, the impact ringing through the hull like a bell, and Ito let out a strangled cry of fear. Return, fire. Ishida's voice had lost its command authority, becoming shrill with panic. All units, return fire. The tanks opened up with everything they had. Machine guns chattering, main guns booming, high explosive shells detonating in the tree line and accomplishing nothing except shredding vegetation and revealing their own positions. Hiroshi watched in horror as 3 more tanks took hits in quick succession. Their thin armor no match for weapons fired from concealed positions at point-blank range. We cannot stay here, Hiroshi shouted into the radio. Captain, we must advance or retreat. But there was nowhere to go. The lead tanks were blocked by Fujimoto's disabled vehicle. The road behind them was too narrow to turn around. They were trapped in a killing corridor, and the enemy knew it. Private Watanabe's tank suddenly lurched forward in a panic, the young driver losing his nerve, trying to push past the wreckage ahead. The tank slid off the road's edge, its right track spinning uselessly over empty air as the hull tilted dangerously toward a steep ravine. A mortar round landed directly on the engine deck of the 6th tank in line. The explosion blew the hatches open, and flames roared skyward as ammunition began cooking off inside, each shell detonating in a chain reaction that turned the tank into a funeral pyre for its crew. Hiroshi gripped the edge of his hatch, watching his regiment die around him, understanding with terrible clarity why 90% of them would never leave these islands alive. Reverse, now. Captain Ishida's voice finally cut through the chaos with a command that made sense. All units, combat reverse! Break contact. Corporal Sato threw the tank into reverse, the transmission grinding as the Type 95 lurched backward. Other tanks followed, their crews finally given permission to escape the slaughter. But reversing along a narrow jungle road while under fire was like trying to thread a needle while drowning. Hiroshi watched through his rear periscope as 2 more tanks collided in the confusion, their hulls scraping together, blocking the road completely. The crews abandoned their vehicles and ran into the jungle on foot, leaving millions of yen worth of equipment behind. We have to stop meeting them like this, Hiroshi muttered, his mind racing. We cannot fight what we cannot see. They retreated 3 kilometers before Ishida finally ordered a halt in a small clearing where the tanks could at least form a defensive circle. Of the 23 tanks that had begun the advance, only 14 made it back. 9 sat abandoned or burning along that cursed road, and with them, 17 men dead and 11 wounded. Captain Ishida climbed down from his tank, his uniform soaked with sweat, his face gray with the realization of what had just happened. The other surviving officers gathered around him. Hiroshi, Lieutenant Koji Harada, whose gunner had been killed, and Lieutenant Ryota Kimura, who had somehow kept his crew alive through sheer luck. We cannot continue like this, Hiroshi said, his voice low but firm. Every advance costs us tanks we cannot replace. The enemy knows our tactics better than we know theirs. Ishida looked at him with hollow eyes. What do you suggest, Lieutenant? Disobey orders? Abandon our mission? No, sir. But we must change how we fight. The tanks cannot lead. We need infantry to scout ahead, to clear the routes, to flush out the ambush positions before we commit armor. Harada nodded agreement. And we must stop moving in single file. We are lined up like targets in a shooting gallery. But the roads, Ishida protested weakly. The jungle, we have no choice. Then we make new roads, Hiroshi said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. We use the tanks as they should be used, supporting infantry, not charging ahead blindly. If you are still with us, hoping these men find a way to survive, take a moment and remember their names. This story is far from over, and what happens next will test everything they thought they knew about war. Ishida looked at the surviving tanks, at the exhausted crews, at the smoke rising from the road behind them. Finally, he nodded slowly. We report to division headquarters. We recommend new tactics, and we pray they listen before we lose everyone. But even as he spoke, the radio crackled with new orders. Advance resumed at dawn tomorrow, same objective, same route. The war did not care about lessons learned or tactics changed. It only cared about orders followed and objectives taken, no matter the cost. Dawn came too quickly. But this time everything was different. Hiroshi had spent the entire night arguing with Captain Ishida, drawing diagrams in the dirt, explaining tactics he had never been taught but somehow understood in his bones, and miraculously Ishida had listened. More than that, he had convinced the battalion commander to try something unprecedented. This time, the tanks would not lead. 2 companies of infantry moved ahead through the jungle on foot, silent and slow, probing for mines, marking ambush positions, clearing the route meter by meter. The tanks followed 100 meters behind, engines idling low, ready to provide fire support but not exposed to the initial contact. It felt wrong to every instinct drilled into them during training. Tanks were supposed to be the spearhead, the iron fist that smashed through enemy lines, but those tactics had been written for open terrain in Manchuria, not for this green hell where visibility ended at the next tree. Contact front. The infantry radioed back. Enemy position 70 meters, concealed in a ravine. Instead of charging blindly forward, Hiroshi's tank crept to a hull-down position where only the turret was exposed. Yamamoto tracked the coordinates, adjusted elevation, and fired 3 high-explosive rounds into the ravine. The enemy position disappeared in a cascade of dirt and shattered trees. The infantry advanced. The tanks followed, leapfrogging from position to position, always with cover, always with infantry screening ahead. They reached San Miguel village by noon with 0 tank losses. The transformation continued over the following weeks. Hiroshi and the other surviving officers rewrote their tactics daily, learning from every engagement, adapting to terrain that fought them as hard as the enemy did. They stopped using roads entirely, instead having infantry engineers clear paths through lighter jungle. They learned to recognize ground that would support their weight and ground that would swallow them whole. Lieutenant Harada developed a system of hand signals that allowed infantry and tanks to coordinate without radio chatter that the enemy could intercept. Lieutenant Kimura discovered that the tank's machine guns were far more effective than the main gun in jungle fighting, and he trained his crews accordingly. Private Ito, who had shaken with fear during that first ambush, became Hiroshi's most reliable spotter. His young eyes capable of detecting enemy positions that others missed. Corporal Sato learned to read the jungle floor like a map, instinctively knowing which ground would hold and which would betray them. They were no longer the confident tank regiment that had landed in the Philippines believing their own propaganda. They were something harder, something earned through blood and failure, survivors who had learned their lessons and refused to repeat the same mistakes. But the cost had been devastating. Of the 60 tanks that began the campaign, only 19 remained operational. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. 90% losses, just as history would remember it. Yet somehow, in the ashes of that catastrophe, the survivors had forged themselves into something their training had never prepared them to be. Soldiers who actually understood the war they were fighting. By June 1942, the campaign in the Philippines was effectively over, but the lessons written in blood along those jungle roads would echo far beyond this single island chain. Hiroshi stood beside his battered Type 95, now covered in improvised armor plates scavenged from destroyed vehicles, camouflage netting draped across its hull, mud caked into every crevice. It barely resembled the pristine machine he had commanded 4 months earlier. Neither did he resemble the confident young officer who had believed everything his superiors told him. Of his original crew, only Sergeant Yamamoto and Corporal Sato remained. Private Ito had been killed by shrapnel during the final push toward Corregidor, and his replacement, Private Haru Taniguchi, was still learning that survival meant constant vigilance and zero assumptions. Captain Ishida gathered the surviving tank commanders for what everyone knew would be their final briefing together. 19 tanks remained from 60, 73 men from 240. The numbers told a story that no propaganda could spin into victory. Division headquarters has requested our after-action reports, Ishida said, and for the first time in months, there was something other than exhaustion in his voice. They want to understand what happened here, why our losses were so catastrophic, what we learned. Hiroshi exchanged glances with Harada and Kimura. What they had learned could fill volumes, but it could be summarized in a few brutal truths. Light armor was a death trap in jungle warfare. Tanks without infantry support were targets, not weapons, and doctrine written for one type of war was worse than useless in another. We will tell them everything, Ishida continued. Every mistake we made, every lesson we learned too late, so that the next regiment does not pay the same price we did. But everyone in that circle knew the terrible reality. There would be another regiment, and another, and they would likely repeat the same mistakes because the Imperial Army did not easily admit when its doctrine was fundamentally flawed. The losses would continue, the 90% casualty rate would become a pattern, and young tank commanders would keep dying while learning lessons that should have been taught before the first shot was fired. That evening, Hiroshi wrote a letter he knew would never be sent, documenting everything he had witnessed. Every tactical innovation his regiment had developed through necessity and desperation. He wrote about the inadequacy of thin armor, the need for better coordination with infantry, the importance of terrain analysis over aggressive advancement. He sealed it and placed it in his personal effects, a message in a bottle for a future that might never care enough to read it. Lieutenant Harada approached. Carrying 2 cups of sake, they had liberated from an abandoned warehouse. They drank in silence, watching the sunset over Manila Bay, knowing that 19 tanks and 73 survivors were being celebrated as a successful campaign back home, when the truth was they represented one of the most devastating equipment losses in modern armored warfare. The war would continue. Other regiments would face other jungles, and the lessons would have to be learned again and again, written in fire and steel, and the lives of young men who deserved better than to be sacrificed to outdated doctrine. Tokyo, September 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Tanaka sat in a quiet office in the ruins of what had once been the Imperial Army headquarters, sorting through documents that most people wanted to forget. The war was over. Japan had surrendered, and now came the harder task, understanding what had gone so terribly wrong. He was 32 years old now, though he felt ancient. The bright-eyed tank commander who had landed in the Philippines in early 1942 seemed like a different person entirely, someone naive and foolish who had believed that courage and determination could overcome fundamental tactical failures. Of the 73 men who had survived the Philippine campaign with him, fewer than 20 had lived to see the war's end. Captain Ishida had died at Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Harada had been killed in Burma. Lieutenant Kimura had perished during the defense of Okinawa. Sergeant Yamamoto had survived but lost both legs to a mine in New Guinea. Corporal Sato had simply disappeared somewhere in the Pacific, his fate unknown. A young historian from the occupation forces entered the office, an American lieutenant who seemed impossibly young, carrying a folder marked Philippine Campaign, Armored Operations Analysis. Colonel Tanaka, the American said in careful Japanese, "We have been reviewing casualty reports from your tank regiments in the Philippines. The numbers are extraordinary. Over 90% losses in some units." Hiroshi nodded slowly. "Yes, my regiment lost 41 of 60 tanks, 207 of 240 men." The American opened his folder, pulling out reports, maps, tactical analyses. "We are trying to understand why." The same equipment performed adequately in Manchuria and China. What was different about the Philippines? Everything was different, Hiroshi said quietly. The terrain, the tactics, the enemy. But most importantly, our doctrine was different from reality. We trained to fight one type of war and encountered another entirely. He pulled out his own folder, the one he had been compiling for 3 years, filled with the tactical innovations his regiment had developed too late to save most of their lives, the after-action reports he had written, the lessons he had documented. We learned, eventually, Hiroshi continued. We learned to coordinate with infantry. We learned to respect terrain analysis. We learned that light armor in jungle warfare was suicide. But we learned these lessons at a cost that should never have been paid. The Americans studied the documents with growing interest. This is remarkable. These tactical modifications, if they had been implemented from the beginning, the casualties would have been 30% instead of 90%. Hiroshi finished. Yes, we calculated that as well. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over a Tokyo that was itself a casualty of war, burned and broken and trying to rebuild. If there is any purpose to documenting this history, he said, it is this: that future soldiers do not pay with their lives for the failures of doctrine and preparation. That armies learn to adapt before the shooting starts, not after most of their soldiers are already dead. The American closed his folder respectfully. Your testimony will be included in our analysis, Colonel. Perhaps next time the lessons will be learned before they are written in blood. Perhaps, Hiroshi echoed, though he had learned long ago in a Philippine jungle that hope was a luxury soldiers could rarely afford.